"You're going to stay with Aunt Miranda," my mother said one day, and that was that. I wish I could say I was surprised, but even at 13, I knew it had been a long time coming. My father was a ghost of a memory, and my mother's job had us moving more times than I cared to count. I had overheard her many times on the phone with my grandmother, lamenting how all the upheaval was affecting my education and social life. Truth be told, I had expected to be sent off to a boarding school, not to a relative's home, so I guess I took the news better than she had anticipated. To celebrate, or perhaps to soothe her guilt, she took me to the movies for the first time in years, and even bought me some new clothes. A rare occurrence. If I said I was heartbroken about leaving my mother, I'd be lying. She wasn't a bad mother, but she wasn't a particularly good one either. She provided for me, praised me for good grades, and scolded me for bad ones, but there was no emotional closeness. Neither of us shed tears at our parting. She loved me in her own way, but it wasn't the kind of love that would move her to tears at my departure. And who was I to judge? I felt the same way. My Aunt Miranda, or Aunt Mimi as she insisted I call her, was a tall, broad woman with red gold hair cascading to her shoulders. I hadn't met her before, which wasn't surprising considering my mother had 12 siblings. Aunt Miranda was a good 15 years older than my mother, and by the time my mother was 5, Miranda had already married and moved across the country. They were never close, rarely talked, but they were still family. Aunt Miranda had heard about our situation through one of her brothers and graciously offered to take me in. Her house wasn't very old, built by Uncle Martin's father in a relatively new town. Well, I use the word town loosely. It had maybe 4 or 5 shops, a movie theater, and a population of less than 200. My aunt's house was on a stretch of road, where most of the residential houses were bordered by the road in front and the moor in the back. It's the moor, I guess, that this story is really about. The moor was a mile-wide stretch of eerie, mist-covered land that began right at the southern edge of town. It seemed strange to my young mind that the residential area would be at the very edge of town, but these were mostly country houses with large yards. Along the border between the moor and the houses was a wooden fence with little bells hanging from posts every few feet. I asked my aunt about it at dinner. She smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was too bright, too forced. "Why, that's just a fancy of the people who built the fence. Now listen here, you are not to go near the fences. There are wild animals in the moor, and sometimes they come too close to the houses at night. You will be inside by dusk, or I'll show you why you should be sorry for not listening." And it wasn't far from the truth, I suppose. I was an obedient child with no friends to play with. Her daughters, Lillian and Gwen, were 3 grades above me, already absorbed in their own circles of friends. Maddie, the one my age, disliked me from the start. We shared a room, but she never said a word to me, sometimes just watching me with those cold, unblinking eyes. I would catch her looking at me in a strange way. She must have pitied me for having a mother who wanted me sent away. She wouldn't be the first. The years passed by quietly, if I may say so. I woke up at 6, fed the hens on my designated days, ate breakfast, went to school, and came home at 3. I would read books in my room. We had a dial-up connection, but the computer was in Uncle Martin's study, and we needed his permission to use it. Sometimes at night, we'd hear howls from the moor, and every so often, those howls would drift to the fence's edge. It was always windy at night, and the bells would ring for hours. Surprisingly, I got used to the sound after a couple of months, but those first few nights were nearly sleepless because of the howls and the bells. When I was 15, I decided to get a job. By then, Lillian and Gwen had moved out, and I stayed in their room. Maddie had softened up a bit, but still had a habit of falling silent and watching me whenever we were in the same room. I hadn't heard from my mother in over a year, and I was frankly worried that when the time came for me to go to college, I wouldn't have enough to cover the fees. I was as straight a student, but didn't want to end up going to the community college 8 miles away. I could imagine Uncle Martin driving me to the college town in his old sedan, me getting off and walking through the narrow streets with buildings in desperate need of new paint. Small classrooms packed with people from neighboring towns, people who grew up hearing the bells and howls, people who didn't find it strange, people who were perfectly content to live their lives out like this. It was during my job at the grocery store, a job that also included delivering groceries to customers, that I met old Miss Hodgins. She lived by the National Highway in a house without bells, which made me curious. Over time, she told me bits and pieces about the bells. They ward off animals, she said. Loud sounds scare them away, like banging on tin drums to scare off tigers. I was skeptical at first, but later found out it was true. They did that in India. Miss Hodgins hadn't put up bells because her husband scoffed at the idea. He had a shotgun, and when he died at 37, the shotgun became hers. She had 3 children, but they were all married and lived far away. They hadn't visited their mother in 10 years. I felt bad for her, but since I had to be home by 6, I couldn't spend a lot of time at her house after school and work. However, on weekends, I would visit her instead of spending time at school. She seemed grateful for the company and had a lot of books to lend me. They weren't like the books in the library. They were thick, leather-bound volumes of strange tales, some factual, some fantasy, but I enjoyed both. Sometimes I would read to her, and sometimes I would read while she knitted or dozed, or both in turns. Her health was deteriorating badly, and I suggested she see a doctor. When she refused because she had no money, I offered to pay with the money I made. She just scoffed and patted my head. Later, I realized that a grocery store assistant's earnings weren't nearly enough to cover the cost of a doctor in those days. The year I turned 16, the summer was unusually hot. Aunt Miranda usually went around the house closing windows and lighting mosquito repellents near 5, but even the strongest repellents weren't enough to deter me. I'd keep my window open for an extra hour or two to catch a breeze. One stiflingly hot day, after cycling back and forth delivering groceries, I was exhausted. Our town seemed to be filled more and more with old people. It wasn't surprising, given how it was stagnating. That happens to most little podunk towns like ours eventually. It was 7:59 when I opened the window and saw the thing. I don't know what it was, but it stared at me from beyond the fence with the wildly ringing bells. Its eyes were vacant, milky white, and its body was a glistening mass of black, blending with the evening darkness. I didn't know what to do, but by some miracle, I didn't shout. All I could think was that I didn't want my aunt to hear me and know what I had done. I finally understood why she closed the windows and insisted I be home by dusk. It snarled and tried to jump over the fence, but fell back as if hitting an invisible wall. I closed the window and went back to my book, pretending the bells would hold it back. I wondered about Miss Hodgins, how she could live in her little house with its beautiful herb garden and white picket fence, but without any bells. She had warned me about wild animals and told me to use the highway, not the moor, when visiting her. She always shooed me away by 4:30 so I wouldn't be out after dark. I wondered too about her husband's death and her children who never visited. The next day was a Saturday. As we were wrapping up at the grocery store, Miss Hodgins called. Since the last Sunday, I knew her groceries wouldn't last much longer. I didn't know why she hadn't called earlier. Honestly, I would have gone to her if I hadn't seen what I saw the night before. It was 5 when my boss finally agreed to let me take his car instead of my bike. It would cut the journey to her house from 30 minutes to 15, and I'd be back home comfortably by 6. I knocked on her door and waited, hearing her shuffle around inside. She was taking a long time to come to the door. I felt uneasy after the previous night, so after 10 minutes, I decided to leave the groceries by her door. She was probably in the bathroom, and I didn't want to linger near the highway as it got dark. I wanted to pretend I hadn't seen anything. and seeing something again would ruin that. As I turned to go, I heard the door open. Miss Hodgins smiled at me brightly, but her smell was strange, and I wondered if she was taking care of herself properly. I promised myself I'd check on her tomorrow. "Come inside, child," she said. I was surprised, but concern bloomed in my chest. Her eyes were failing, and she was nearly 80. If she was asking me to stay, she must be hurt. Could the smell be an infected wound she couldn't reach? "What's wrong, Miss Hodgins?" I asked. "Come inside now," she said, a note of fear in her voice. I looked at her garden, once lush, now withering. Her eyes, once merely failing, were now a milky white. I forced a smile and bent down to pick up the groceries. "I'll just bring these in for you, okay?" "I know your back is bad," I said, trying to mask my growing dread. A smile bloomed on her face, her teeth blackened and stained, reeking of rotten eggs. "Can you make some room for this in the kitchen?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She nodded and turned back towards the kitchen, barely visible from the door, and disappeared inside. I put the groceries on the floor, then booked it back to the car. I could hear her howl as I thanked God I had left the car door open and the engine running. I don't think I could have started the car if I had taken the keys out of the ignition. My hands were shaking so badly. Before the door had even closed properly, I hit reverse. I could see Miss Hodgins now, her teeth bared as she howled and howled. The white picket fences surrounding her house were now splintered and broken. How hadn't I noticed that before? I made a U-turn that almost sent me tumbling into the moor on the other side, then floored the accelerator. It was 5:48 when I got home. I immediately called my boss to let him know I'd have his car back at the store tomorrow and that he should send more than one person to Miss Hodgins' place. I told him she wasn't herself. He went quiet and didn't ask any more questions. The next morning, I awoke feeling horrible. With time to think, I realized how badly I had handled everything. I should have been more honest. Now they'd go to her place not knowing anything about what awaited them. I didn't know what that thing was or what it could do to a person. I ran downstairs and told Uncle Martin everything. All he said was not to worry about it and not to tell Aunt Miranda. Later, I found out they had discovered Mrs. Hodgins dead in her bedroom. She had been dead for at least 2 days. I never asked anything about it. There were 2 more years until I turned 18, and I spent those 2 years hardly speaking at all. Maddie and I became closer somehow. We would sit in the same room and read, and when we heard a howl or the bells start to ring, she would come sit by me. We started sharing the same room again, even though I never told her what had happened. My oldest cousin never wrote home or visited in the 5 years I was there. After I left for college, I still wrote to Maddie frequently and to my aunt and uncle during the holidays. I don't think we were close though. I drifted through life, and the only person I had ever felt truly close to was probably Mrs. Hodgins. I tried my best to forget what had happened and to forget about the things I had read in Mrs. Hodgins, books about certain herbs and herb gardens being used to ward off beings with no names or descriptions. And I almost succeeded until recently. I was looking through a real estate site when I came across a listing. The picture felt more familiar than my own face. It was a small cottage surrounded by the remnants of a withered herb garden on 3 sides and the highway on the 4th. In bold red letters at the bottom of the listing, it read, "Sold."